Hello and welcome to Angular Air, episode 25, talking about ES6 and whether you should be using Babel or in what conditions you should be using Babel versus TypeScript on your Angular project. So my name is Jeff Welpley. I'm filling in for Kent C. Dodds today, and we also have Patrick Stapleton with us. Patrick, why don't you say hi?
Hey guys.
We're going to have Amy join us a little bit later in the broadcast, but let's get started. So the topic for today is one because every Angular developer is going to be faced with this question sometime in the next year as they start to think about Angular 2. They start to see a lot of the ECMAScript 6, ECMAScript 2015, whatever you want to call it, stuff start to become a reality. So let's first kind of go over some of the options available and kind of what they entail. So obviously most people have their current projects just using ES5, but Patrick, why don't you tell us a little bit about TypeScript first, and then we'll talk about Babel before we get into kind of comparing the two.
Yeah, so TypeScript is really just a superset on top of ES6. So essentially it's ES6 plus types. And types is pretty much optional, but with TypeScript you get a lot of benefits over tooling. So you get autocompletion. That's like one thing that's missing from JavaScript development compared to other languages, is that you're able to, in other languages, you're able to, with an editor, like autocomplete, like what exactly is the next thing, or what are the methods for this particular thing. We don't quite have that story in JavaScript, so TypeScript allows us to have that, and is able to help us kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like testing your code without any tests. It's like another layer. So it's also great for figuring out that this parameter is actually different, actually requires this, or you're actually using this wrong. And that's because you define the types and everything. So it pretty much just gives you more structure in your dynamic language, but that's optional. Yep.
And what about Babel? So what's the difference between if you were going to use TypeScript and if you're going to use just basic ES6 using Babel as a transpiler?
Yeah. So Babel is more of like, it's good to kind of like remember how Babel started, right? So when Tracer came out, it was kind of an experiment for people to kind of dabble in this new like language features and kind of figure out what's good and what's not. And what happened is that the output of that code was actually really, like, it was really hard to kind of for humans to kind of figure out what's going on. And
with Tracer, you're talking about that, or
yeah, I'm talking about so Tracer, it compiles code, so it compiles like ES6-ish code to ES5. It was created by Google as a way to experiment, but because this one guy, he saw like everyone kind of agreed on this opinion that like that code didn't really make sense, and that's because it's optimized for computers. It makes sense. Babel was created, and it started with just one simple thing, and that is creating a class. Very simply using the actual, like as if you would write it in ES5, and from there it actually like grew to what it is today, and actually like adding like all of the ES6 features. And for a time it was called 6 to 5 because it was compiling ES6 to 5, but that was before Babel started introducing ES7 stuff, and then it would be called 7 to 5 or 7 to 6, and then it was getting a little hairy there. But that's kind of the history of Babel, is that it started with, I want the output to look like as if I wrote it. So like it's keeping in that mindset of just keep it more around ES5.
Yeah, and the creator of Babel is Sebastian McKenzie, a really interesting guy. I think he's going to be on. He's recording a JavaScript Jabber episode later today, which is going to be really interesting. Teenager when he created the 6 to 5 project that's just kind of gone bonkers. So he's pretty awesome. So I'm curious, before we kind of get into the whole, Babel versus TypeScript thing, there's a lot of people out there that just like ES5 the way it is, like Douglas Crockford, for example, and a lot of people who prefer kind of functional programming, don't care about types, don't care about some of the syntactical sugar. So what is the problem with just sticking with ES5? Like, is there any downside to that?
So there's technically no downside to sticking with ES5. The whole point of the web is not to break the web, so everything about the web has to be backwards compatible. And there are people who are very vocal in this regard. Like pretty much everyone who's notable in JavaScript actually really kind of hates classes in that regard, like Douglas Crawford, and but like that's largely due to a lot of the problems of a lot of bad practices and bad patterns that a lot of people use in other languages and other projects, and that is like having a deeply nested class hierarchy where you have this inherits this and inherits this and this inherits that. And the problem is that it's really hard to change the top layer class without affecting everything. It's really hard to change this because it's basically like CSS in that regard, where if once you create it, it's kind of there, and then you just have to create more of it, and you don't want to break everything else. And that's kind of like where everyone kind of like is saying it's kind of like going against this class movement. But kind of like the reason why we'd want to do this is because the browsers are, I mean, like they're written in other languages. Right? Deep down in lower levels, they use object-oriented design patterns, and one of the advantages of classes is that you, at a lower level, it actually mimics the class in that language, and that's something that you don't really know, but whenever you create an object literal, it's actually reflecting that at a lower level with an actual class for each object. And when you create a prototype chain, it's essentially, it has to make a lookup for each one of those prototypes in your chain that you're delegating to, and it has to keep that in memory. But I guess the other telling of the times is really just like when is Dart, for example, like they create, like Google, they created Dart. This is yet another language that compiles to JavaScript, but basically that is a classical system. Dart is basically what if JavaScript was created in a classical system and just classes, no prototypes. That's pretty much what would happen. And the speed benefits there is just you get twice as fast speed just because you're able to, again, like mimic as much as possible of the structure.
Well, before we digress into some of the well, so before we digress into some of that, I think it might be good to talk about just with either TypeScript or ES5 in our current projects before we get into kind of like the future and why we would want to use this moving forward. In my Angular 1 app that I have today, how can I start to use some of this? How would you suggest, Patrick, that you would start to implement either Babel and ES6, or would you go straight to TypeScript with your current project?
Yeah, so how would I start? Can you say that again? Like,
so in your current Angular 1 project today,
yeah,
how would you start to implement, would you, or have you started to use either Babel or TypeScript in your current project?
So I've been using TypeScript for the most part, for the better part of the few recent months, but I recommend everyone to just turn on, Babel, because the whole point, I think it's a good introduction to start with Babel, and then if you feel like diving into TypeScript, to do that. But essentially, the whole part of the web is not to break the web, so you could literally turn on Babel and not use any of the ES6 features, and you would still, everything will still be fine. So I think the best part, or the best migration, is just to get your build system to use Babel, and then just that's pretty much it, and you just start writing it. The other way of doing that is basically in your build system, have your files say like babel.js or es.es6.js, then have your build system detect those files and compile those only in Babel. So that way you know explicitly like this file's for ES6 or ES7 or Babel, and then these other files are just ES5. So I think that that's one of the best ways to kind of get started, just to get the system up and running. With Angular, like you could start using like again like the class systems. Like in Angular 2, it's kind of normal to use the service, the dot service syntax. No, this isn't. So in Angular 1, sorry. In Angular 1, there's a dot service. There's a dot factory dot service dot provider. The pattern that Angular 2 uses mostly is the dot service pattern, and that is creating a class where the arguments in the constructor gets injected. So for the migration plan of switching to these other languages, it's a good idea to start creating your services with classes and using that, because that alone transfers very well to Angular 2, because the only difference is just the DI, and the DI is basically how your services get injected in your other services. So the stuff that gets injected inside of the constructor parameters.
Okay, so it sounds like you're using both Angular or TypeScript rather, and Babel in some of the current stuff you're working on. Amy, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Sorry, a little late.
No, it's fine. So, Amy, have you started to use either Babel or TypeScript in any of your current projects?
Yeah, at home, and then actually we're using it in production at my job as well. So we've started to convert some of our Angular 1 stuff over to ES6 in hopes of making migration easier.
And so is there a reason why you guys chose to use Babel then instead of TypeScript?
There wasn't a huge discussion around it. I think we went with Babel because, well, actually I take that back. We did discuss it a little bit, and I think because we also use Node for our APIs, that we liked the idea. I don't know. I guess you can use TypeScript and Node, but we like the idea of having something a little lighter weight that we could use on the full stack. So, yeah, we just didn't do a whole lot of discussion around TypeScript. It was kind of just already Babel.
Okay. Well, how about this? Let's get into some of the kind of advantages, disadvantages. I'd like to kind of go through, and maybe we'll circle back or whatever, but let's just kind of hit one up at a time. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What kind of some things that we can kind of pull together, and then maybe we'll kind of compare them some more after we kind of go through the initial list. So let's start off with Babel. And Amy, let's kind of go back to you, since you have been using this a lot in production.
Yep.
What are the advantages of using Babel?
Like I said, I don't know. I think for us, so the application that we work on is extremely large. So we, I think we like the idea of, with Babel, as for on the front end, as the browsers start to support these features, it's very easy to turn off that transpiling and just fall back to the actual browser support. I guess same thing with Node itself. When it's, if it were to start supporting some of these features, we could fall back to the native support. Whereas TypeScript, you're, you can turn off things, but you're locked in. If you use TypeScript features, you're locked into those features.
Okay, that's good. And then Patrick, anything you want to add there for advantages on the Babel side?
Yeah, that's basically, she touched all the good ones. Essentially, there's not a lot of, compared to TypeScript, there's not a lot of overhead. It's more of like progressive. You can use as much features as you want or much, and you're not tied into some of the features that are just TypeScript features. So yeah.
Okay, the one thing I would add actually is the community size that,
Yep.
when you compare, TypeScript is not small by any means, but it is, somewhat more limited. Like there's people, a lot of React developers that are starting to use Babel, like a lot of, from many different JavaScript frameworks have kind of converged on using Babel, whereas TypeScript, is very popular for people that, currently use, Java as a backender, .NET, and a lot of people that are starting to look into Angular 2 even. But when you compare either the GitHub stars or just kind of the general feel out there, I've always found that it's not only more popular, and what does that translate to? Like, it means for supporting libraries, for a lot of the things like, okay, I have a question and I look it up, and this is from my own experience, and kind of I work with one project using Babel, for work, and then for the Angular 2 core work that I do, it's TypeScript, and I found that it's just much easier to find the answers to my questions and things that people have already written on the kind of Babel side of things. Have you guys found that to be the same as well?
Yeah, for me probably. I mean, so when I was in my boot camp last year, we already started looking at ES6 and started using it in some of our apps. So I definitely was exposed to it much earlier. That's as far as my take on it.
Okay, so let's move to some of the disadvantages, if there are any. Patrick, do you see, and obviously compared to using something like TypeScript, like where is maybe Babel doesn't do as well?
Yeah, so technically this is a disadvantage for both, but essentially just the fact that you have to compile something, like technically you could include a browser compiler that is good, that's okay for development purposes and just stuff to hack away. But one of the disadvantages that these languages both have is the fact that you have to have a build system, and how so it's kind of like a whole other discussion, but essentially that's a disadvantage. The other disadvantage is an advantage of TypeScript, so it technically doesn't really matter, but it's just like autocompletion. That's also that doesn't make sense as a disadvantage, but I guess.
Well, I think what you're saying there is that it's not that there isn't any autocompletion when you use Babel. I think that what's the new IDE that a lot of the React guys use now? Do you remember, Patrick?
No.
Anyway, there are ways of doing. When WebStorm even has some level of autocompletion, but it is better with TypeScript. Like if you are in Visual Studio Code, if you have all of your type definition files set up, I mean, it's just much better. It's more thorough for sure.
I would say too, for our team, so back to talking about that, I would say the decision makers all use Vim, and at least half of our team uses Vim. So the tooling is, I think when we talked on JS Jabber with the TypeScript people, you can set up tooling with Vim, but it's extremely difficult. Or no, not as easy as it would be if you're just using.
Yeah, I don't know many people that are Vim TypeScript users for sure.
Yeah, I don't either.
Okay, so let's move on. We sort of overlapping here. You started to get into some of the advantages of TypeScript. Basically coming down to the tooling, really, right? What is it about the way TypeScript is set up as far as an advantage goes that the tooling provides a benefit, Patrick?
Yeah, I guess it's worth noting that that as of right now we can't really find any disadvantage for Babel. So now back to TypeScript. The advantages of TypeScript is actually the type system itself, and that's harking back to the autocompletion that we spoke about earlier. Essentially, you can have autocompletion with like stuff like you could include a code snippet thing for Angular, a code snippet for React, but the problem is that it's not smart. Like you'll type in something in like React, and then you'll get an autocompletion for Angular, and vice versa for Angular, and that's because it's not the editor or the IDE is not smart enough to figure out what your code's doing, and that's something that the editor can do with TypeScript because it's able to figure out, it's able to statically analyze your code and figure out exactly where are the moving parts, and that's what TypeScript really is. It's just saying these types go in and these types go out of these functions, and then from there you're able to determine like where the flow of code is actually going, and because of that you're able to get actual autocompletion that's actually smart and correct, as opposed to like other code snippet plugins where you just don't have that. And the big advantage is basically for large applications, you literally could just press dot, and then you could just type in stuff, and you could see like exactly the method name, and you don't have to typo the method name at all. Or like, what if like your teammate decides to write this particular method in snake case rather than camel case? Well, the autocompletion will actually like show you that, and you can actually use the correct method rather than getting a silent error, like type of undefined is not a function, rather than the famous JavaScript error. Like you'll actually like not have that because of the autocompletion. So like that's kind of the biggest advantage of TypeScript is that and it's mostly for like larger teams because in that regard, because the idea is that it's the same thing like with CSS, where you essentially, it's really hard to determine, it's really hard to keep the whole system in your head, right, in a large application, and because of that, teams are usually isolated to one particular part of the web page sometimes, and that's why like having stuff like autocomplete and is great for larger teams, because you're now able to determine like the interface for something like a lot easier.
One thing you mentioned that we didn't really have any real disadvantages for Babel, and maybe that's true, but one thing that is an advantage for Angular that you mentioned that sort of is somewhat disadvantageous on the Babel side in regard to Angular 2 is the syntax sugar that is within TypeScript for dependency injection. So in Angular 2 and TypeScript, when you define your types, in your class, let's say, or a factory function, you have your input parameters, and you can define your types with colon and then the type name, right? With Angular 2, it kind of overloads that syntax so that it will do a binding automatically and instantiate that object. And so it's just sugar, because you can do the same ES6 Babel if you want. It's just more typing because you have to do the bind function and everything. But it does look a little bit cleaner. So that's just like one small thing that is kind of an advantage for TypeScript as well with Angular 2.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, and what happens there is that in TypeScript you're able to say emit metadata, and essentially what it's doing is that it's emitting the types that are in the constructor, and then Angular is able to hook into that, and then with the DI system in Angular 2, essentially, rather than in Angular 1, where the token is just a string, and so let me just like step back a little bit. So like in Angular 1, you inject things using string tokens, and that is essentially the array, and then string this, string that, and then function. So basically, each one of those strings is a token that represents that particular service. Now in Angular 2, you're able to use the function itself and this particular type and say this type is this service, right? So that's pretty much what Angular 2 takes advantage of, and say like, and rather than a string syntax, which you could still do that, but with TypeScript, because this is kind of built into the language, you're able to emit that metadata. Essentially, English is able to hook into that and give you a very, very clean way of injecting your dependencies, which is actually like really, really nice. And in fact, you could just use TypeScript just for that feature alone, and it would be great. And you get the benefits of the autocompletion and everything. And then that's essentially, to be honest, like that's what mostly I use it for, is just for that, and then the autocompletion and stuff. But if the application gets a lot larger, then it's good to know that you could just add more types to this, or something like that, and then yeah. So
yeah, it'd be interesting. One thing you'd mentioned earlier, Patrick, is about Dart, when you were kind of digressing into it, one of your tangents, and the original reason why the Google team used Dart, from my understanding, from kind of talking to some of their team members, was for the strong typing, some of the similar capabilities that are now being provided with TypeScript that weren't kind of available as much back then. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where the direction of kind of Dark goes in the future as TypeScript kind of gains prominence. But before we move on to kind of disadvantages, Amy, was there anything you wanted to add there for advantages on the TypeScript side?
I would not be a fair one to say because I have not really used it other than little bitty things at home, so I better not speak.
No worries. Okay, so disadvantages, and I can start off here, because this is kind of the one thing that I'm sure everybody who gets started with TypeScript, including myself, kind of ran into, which is kind of the type definition wrangling. Like, it's great to have the types and having autocompletion in your IDE, Visual Studio Code, or whatever you're going to use, WebStorm. But there's some work you have to do to get there, right? And I think I've definitely had frustration. I know that a lot of people that start to use TypeScript before they get used to it have, which is, not every library has the types defined. Not everything is written in TypeScript, obviously. So you have to provide some of the type definitions. Now, a lot of them are available on the Definitely Typed website, where you can kind of just download it and use their types. But it's just one of these, additional things to manage. Sometimes the types from Definitely Typed aren't exactly right. Sometimes they don't keep up to date with the underlying library. There's all sorts of like little things that kind of got you. Patrick, do you have anything to add on that point?
yeah, I definitely agree with you. Like when starting a repo with TypeScript, it's more of like, so for me, like I kind of like even though it's kind of a pain, I just kind of got used to it. But essentially, it's like, oh, I'm going to start a TypeScript repo. So let me just get my TST, which is the TypeScript definition command line utility. Let me get that. Let me download all these types. Let me set up my types in order to structure it in such a way that makes sense for me. And then you run into, like you said, problems with some type definitions that are just not complete. Like just recently, I submitted a pull request for Browserify's type system, and basically, because it's largely community-driven, it kind of sucks in that regard because it's up to the community to update that, and that's largely due to these projects not being created in TypeScript. And that's not like saying that they should or anything, but that's kind of like the disadvantages of TypeScript is because everything's not written in TypeScript. Not a lot of people really care about that, and it leaves it to the community to do that. And there's there's a huge community that's actually doing TypeScript, so a lot of the types are there. So.
Well, that's true. Yeah. But I mean, like you said, sometimes they aren't up to date and everything. And actually, a second thing I would add is that there is a pretty big community for TypeScript. A lot of the stuff that you find on the just Babel side of things, tooling-wise, there is an equivalent. But what I found is actually there's a lot of tools that don't cross over. Like, you can't use some of the tools that are built, for Babel for just ES6. You need a TypeScript specific version of that tool, and kind of one of the examples there is the linting tool. Like, so you can't really use ESLint, right? You have to use TSLint, which is similar. There are a lot of like similarities. Like, there's some stuff that you can do the same, but it's not exactly the same. You don't have the number of people contributing to the same. You don't have like the if you want to reuse other people's like style definitions and stuff like that. There's not as many out there. There's like little things like that. And then what about Patrick? As far as like open source, just still on the disadvantage side, and we're talking about contributing to an open source project. Does TypeScript have any adverse impact, or do you think it has an adverse impact to getting contributors? Because I know that was traditionally a problem on the CoffeeScript side. Having something that was not exactly JavaScript. The open source libraries that were written in CoffeeScript have had trouble getting contributors. Do you see that same thing on the TypeScript side?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you brought up CoffeeScript, because I was also in that boat, and what's interesting is that I came from a Ruby background where I actually liked CoffeeScript, because it was like, oh, I don't know JavaScript. What's this CoffeeScript? It looks like Ruby. I like it now. But then I actually learned JavaScript, and I'm like, oh my god, this is awesome. And I actually don't like CoffeeScript. I still use it, still create it and everything. But the thing about CoffeeScript is that it's very terse, and because of that, that's the reason why a lot of people were kind of dissuaded from looking at it. So whenever there's an example and it's in CoffeeScript, everyone's like, I don't even know what's going on here. But for TypeScript, I think it's a little bit different because, for example, code examples are a lot better because we have those types. You're able to say, like, this is exactly what goes in and out. So that's great. But in terms of source code, yeah, there is an overhead, just like CoffeeScript, but I wouldn't say it's just as bad, because picking up TypeScript is pretty easy. It's really just getting used to the ES6 features, and then types are just there, because I think I remember the first time diving into Angular 2 source code. That was pretty fun. I was like, I don't know what's going on here, and there's like so many moving parts. But like, majority of the overhead is just ES6. So if we are in a world where everyone is kind of used to ES6, then contributing to code base in TypeScript is like no-brainer. But there is that overhead of, this isn't what I'm used to, and I have to learn this in order to contribute. But then again, like, if you contribute small feature, which is majority of contributions out there, because essentially people contribute small and then kind of like gain momentum in the repo. But like, because of that trend, it's really easy to contribute to a TypeScript repo or Babel or ES6 repo incrementally, and just say, like, this is how I know how to do it. And then someone will comment saying, oh, could you do this? Could you add these types? And it would be pretty easy to do that. I think it's just like the intimidation of that.
Well, is it fair to say that more than likely something like TypeScript, it will result in probably less contributors, but it'll be easier to maintain the project? I mean, that's at least kind of the way that I see the Angular core project going. That there is this extra barrier that people have to get over, and it is, like some of the stuff you said, it is confusing, intimidating, kind of when you get started. But there's reasons why they're doing that, right? Once you understand everything and actually modifying the code, there's that extra level of safety. There's it's easier to refactor, all of those types of things. So do you think that's the case, Patrick? Yeah,
it's definitely for the Angular team and everything. It's it's easier to maintain a TypeScript repo because you have a better sense of the world. But you're right that it's probably not so much for other people unless they're used to TypeScript. Because yeah, it's definitely probably not the best thing for in terms of trying to get more people on board. But again, like I'm trying to say, like we're reaching a world where ES6 is kind of normal. In which case, if you kind of take that, if ES6 is kind of normal for everyone in the world, then the barrier to entry, I guess, is a lot lower. But we're still on that initial hump where pretty much everyone's switching to ES6. But,
okay, so like the primary advantage with a lot of what we're talking about is kind of the typing and some of the stuff that allows. So Amy, with the current project you're working on with ES6 and Babel, obviously you want to achieve some of the same goals as far as making your code base easier to update and more robust and that type of thing. So what types of strategies, since you guys don't have strong typing, do you guys use like unit tests and that type of thing in order to ensure that the team can work more effectively together, or what types of things do you guys implement along those lines?
Yeah, so we did a bunch of things. Actually, when we started refactoring over to, well, first off, our app was built, before I was there, it was built before a lot of these best practices came out, so we started converting everything to controller as. While we did that, we also started updating stuff to ES6, so when we did that, we put together like some coding standards that are up on our internal documentation so that people have to follow that. We also always do code reviews, but as far as like the code itself, we're also in the process of getting JSCS in there so that it's also going to make sure that some of our styles are there. Always have to have comments, but then yes.
What's a JSCS? Can you?
JSCS, it's my understanding. I think JSCS is like it also does linting, but it also does styling. So if you have like specific internal styles, like you want tabs or your comments have to be a certain way, it will do all of that. It will check for all of that. But as far as testing, yes, so that is huge. We all of our code has to be 100% covered with unit and functional tests unless we have a darn good reason for it. And whoever's doing our code reviews also has to be on the same page that like this is nearly impossible to test. So you're okay with not having it covered. So I would say our biggest strategies are the unit and functional tests, and then just very strict on commenting.
Okay. And I mean, I've heard a similar thing from other people. Trying basically using testing to help out, validate, do the same types of things that you would do with strong typing to ensure that the right data is being passed in and that type of thing. But if you were to take things further, one thing that some people have brought up is if you really did want to have strong typing, with Babel, what about using something like Flow, like from Facebook's Flow system, which is another typing system. It can still, whereas TypeScript, is something set. You can't really use TypeScript and Babel together. Those are kind of like two ways of accomplishing the same goal, or two different ways, or whatever. But Flow does fit in, that you could use Flow and Babel. So, Amy, have you guys looked into that, or have any thoughts on that side?
We're not actually doing it, but it has been discussed. So it's definitely something that we're thinking about.
Okay. And Patrick, have you looked into that at all?
Yeah. So all I know about Flow is that there's one differentiator between Flow and TypeScript, and that is kind of the philosophy of types. So with Flow, their philosophy of types is basically that it's more centric around JavaScript and how dynamic it is, as opposed to TypeScript, which is more of like derived from from other languages, which is why like TypeScript is easier for a lot of people coming from other languages because it's very similar. With Flow, it's similar in that regard that you do get types, but it's more geared towards the dynamic nature of JavaScript. But with that said, I haven't dove into it or anything other than knowing that.
Yeah, in other words, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, understood. Okay, so we have a couple questions that people posted on Twitter. We have a couple more minutes if anybody wants to tweet to the tag ngr question. So let's go over those, and then if anybody else gets a question in, we'll answer that, and then we'll get to Pics. So first one up is it possible to specify a TypeScript interface in a constructor and configure DI to specify the concrete class to inject? And I believe this is what Angular 2 is doing, or maybe this person is asking, without Angular 2. Patrick, why don't you field this one?
Yeah, so you're able to specify interfaces in TypeScript. Essentially, it's kind of like, you could think of it as like a way to define how this should be. It's kind of hard to explain it with words, but essentially, I don't know if that's possible to do that.
Patrick, we're on a podcast. You have to use words.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm saying I don't know how to explain an interface. It's easier just to show it, that people kind of get it instantly. But essentially, I don't know if you're able to create an interface and specify the types in the constructor of the interface. So you're able to say this interface has a constructor that has these parameters. I don't know if TypeScript right now is able to emit those. That's actually a really interesting question. I'll try it out, but I don't know if that's possible to do that. It's a very interesting question.
Okay. Maybe something, Patrick, after you look into it, you could post on our Google Plus page.
Yep, I could post it on Google Plus, and then I'll tweet it back.
Okay. Next question is, which workflow would you currently recommend between TypeScript, ES6 Babel, ES5, or rather TypeScript ES5? I think, okay, I think I had a reverse. I think they're saying if you start off at ES5, either going straight to TypeScript or TypeScript to Babel and then, ES5 to Babel and then TypeScript. So whether you have basically Babel as a kind of an interim step, which I think Patrick was starting to suggest. So since Patrick, you started to suggest this before, which of those two were you recommending?
I think it depends on how tolerant you are to change and how much you're willing to learn, because you could jump from ES6 all the way to TypeScript and just say oh, I'm just going to learn all this, or I'm just going to do all this right now. Or you could do the incremental changes, just turn on Babel, then once you are ready enough and understand ES6, then go to TypeScript. I think it's a matter of just preference from there, because for me, I jumped from ES5 to TypeScript, and then from there it's easy enough to pick up anything else. But I think it's just a matter of preference. I would personally recommend ES5 to Babel to TypeScript, just because it's the incremental step, and once you learned ES5 with Babel, it's easy enough to just use TypeScript. But it also depends on you and your team. If you have a large team, then it actually does make more sense to do TypeScript, just because you have the autocompletion and that safety with that. Yeah.
I'm curious because we've said a number of times that you have a large team. There's more advantages to using something like TypeScript. What about the case? And maybe I'd like the opinions of both of you guys. If you were going to start, let's say, a new startup today, so you don't have anything. There's no pre-existing code or whatever, and it's something where you got a lot of funding, so it'll be a fast growth business. So small team to start off with that will probably grow to be larger over time, but initially is smaller. it is harder to write something once and then rewrite it. So in that type of situation, what would you guys do? Would you start off with Babel, or would you start off right away with TypeScript? And Amy, maybe go to you first.
Oh man, so yeah, there's too many outside factors for me to answer this question well. Like things that I would consider would be, the developers that I'm getting on. If they are, just their background would affect my decision.
Well, what type, like just diving into that a little bit, like what type of things in their background are you referring to?
If they were not super comfortable with JavaScript, I might go with, the Babel approach because, like you said, there's more documentation out there. Also, like experience level. This is a tough question. I would say if the people were super experienced, then maybe I would have a little bit more trust to go the Babel route. If we're like growing really rapidly and we have a lot of people on the team that aren't horribly familiar, I do like the safety from what I've heard, the safety of having TypeScript just because of, makes the code more readable and the checking in there and stuff. I don't know. That's a tough question. I don't have a good answer. There's too many outside factors that I'd have to weigh in on it. It would depend too, like, does this business, are we in it like for the long haul, or are we more in it like to like get an MVP up really quick and see what happens? Like getting an MVP up really quick, I don't know, maybe TypeScript, but if we're in it for the long haul, I like the idea of having Babel in there. It's a little more lean and you can take it out more easily.
Okay, no, that's some great points. I think some of the really good things to consider. Patrick, what about you on your side?
Yeah, so technically the startup question is completely, it's a whole different topic, because the idea with the startup is that you want to, like, the product's more important than the tooling, so like the customer doesn't care what 50 shades of JavaScript you're running, right? So it's really just like whatever you're comfortable with and build fast. So I think your question is more geared towards like, if you're starting a new project, what would you recommend? And that's more of like, again, it's a similar thing where it's like whatever you're comfortable with and go from there. Do incremental changes. Like I still think like going from just turning on Babel.
Most people are comfortable just with ES6.
Yeah, but that's the thing is like you can't, like, the whole point of this like venture into new languages and everything is to help push the web forward. Like if everyone is talking about ES6 and all of its features in Babel and TypeScript, then it will be implemented in the browsers, and then we don't have to worry about the transpilers anymore. But yeah, like I technically still recommend like people just whatever you're comfortable with, and Babel, which is the reason why it's so popular, allows you to do that because you're able to do incremental. To like, oh, I just only want to use the function fat arrow syntax and nothing else, and that's totally legitimate.
I'll take sort of a little bit from what both you were saying and have my kind of own suggestion, because I agree, depends on the team, depends on preferences, all that type of thing. One thing I've seen that actually is pretty successful is if you're working on a team, go ahead and pick some sort of project, have a couple people implement the project, something small, obviously, using TypeScript. Other people implement it using ES6 and Babel, and then kind of compare, talk about it. I found that actually getting your hands dirty, trying it out, having people on the team really use these things, and then kind of compare on the same code, the same thing you're trying to implement, sheds light a lot on those types of things, what you prefer. Because until you do something like that, if you're just reading about what each provides, you can go back and forth in your head all day about what you want to do. So anyway, that's just one thing I heard someone mention once that I think would be a good thing to try out. Okay, we got one more question from Twitter, and then we'll go into Pics. And this one from Sebastian, who also had an earlier question. I'm using TypeScript, but I am thinking about whether to omit from TypeScript to ES5 or omitting to ES6 and then use Babel after. So I guess
it's interesting because I haven't actually thought about that of emitting ES6 from TypeScript. So Patrick, have you kind of seen something like that before, and like what are the reasons why you would want to do something like that?
So I don't know if I understand his question correctly, but I think it's either translating TypeScript to ES5 to ES6 to then use Babel, or emitting TypeScript to ES6 to then transition to Babel. I don't know like what exactly he's trying to get at, but there.
Well, maybe if I was to guess, Sebastian, you can tweet us some more if you have kind of follow-up, but it may be to try to utilize some of the tooling within Babel, because we mentioned that when you are writing in TypeScript, you don't have some of the tooling, but if you did that interim step, then you might be able to do like a ESLint or whatever else, or it could be like you're saying if you were trying to transition.
Oh yeah, like use the other tooling. Well, I think like what sucks about these languages is that you could technically do that, but it's just like the build step and the overhead's just like insane. So what sucks is that you literally have to like pick one or the other. But I think it's good for, like you said earlier, to just do a project. For me, I have like 4 projects where the build system is completely different. I have like a Webpack and TypeScript build, and then I have a System.js build with TypeScript, and then Babel with nothing. So like it's good to just like expose yourself to all these different environments and then figure out. And then it's easier to figure out your opinion from there. So that way, like, so it's good to do this overall. Like to have that's what side projects are great for. Is you have all these side projects with different environments, and then you're able to form opinions to bring back into your company and say like, hey, judging from my side projects, etc., like I have opinions now, and I suggest you should do it for these reasons. I think that's like a good idea, but let's see if he tweeted back.
All right. Yeah, we can bring it up at the end if he does. So let's get right into Pics. We're right at the end. So Amy, why don't you start us off?
Okay, so I haven't been on for a while because I've been super busy, but I've been excited about this pick. So my pick is going to be November. It's a conference in November in Nashville. Nashville is awesome. So that's where I went to school, and I love it, and I miss it, and I am going back. It's going to be my first conference that I'm going to speak at. So they have some awesome keynote speakers. Douglas Crawford is speaking, Yehuda Katz. So I'm going to definitely check that out, and you should go because Nashville is amazing. And that's my pick.
Awesome. Patrick?
Yeah, so one of my picks is next episode, and that's Falcor.js with Joffer from Netflix, if that's a worthy pick. But the other pick is, I guess the tip is pretty much what I said earlier, and that is do side projects and expose yourself to different environments, just because it's great to form an opinion upon things and discover. So that's my tip, is just do side projects, but force yourself to go out of your comfort zone. Yep.
Cool. And for my pick, I am going to pick the not having the Olympics in Boston, something that I am psyched about. They had threatened for months now, I think 6 months, that they were going to bring the Olympics to Boston, which was going to be a complete nightmare. It would have this town is already a mess as it is without trying to jam a million different construction projects down everybody's throat. So I think that even though the polls were at like 70% against or something like that, I think it was more than that. I actually don't know one person who was actually for it. So there's a lot of cheer. It's kind of odd to think that people were happy that they didn't get the Olympics, but that was really the case here, and it was a good day. So just a couple quick announcements. Kent will be back next week, and we have a number of great episodes lined up. Patrick mentioned the next one, which will be Falcor with Jafar. Jafar is an amazing developer, tech lead at Netflix. If you haven't heard him talk yet, He's great. He knows a lot about the future of the web, and he's going to talk about one of his projects that is near and dear to his heart, Falcor, along with Angular 2. And then the week after that, August 11th, we have the privilege of having Gleb Bamatov in to talk about performance testing and everything else under the sun, developer happiness, all sorts of stuff. It's going to be really fun. And then August 18th, we're going to have Martin Gonto, Jeff Goodman, and some of the other people from Auth0 to come in to talk about security on the web and in mobile apps with Angular. So that should be great as well. Definitely follow us on Twitter and Google. We'll be sending out the links for this soon. And
yeah, one more question, or the clarification. Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah. So the clarification in the question earlier was comparing TypeScript's output to ES5 compared to Babel converting to ES5. So like you're saying that Babel might be better emitting ES5 code compared to TypeScript, and that's ultimately like, I mean, like Babel is emitting code that's better for the human to read, as opposed to all the other compilers, which emits it more towards well, TypeScript is a mixture, but essentially this ES5 code is better for the VM, right? So that's why we see Babel, the outputting of Babel code actually look more and more and more like TypeScript's output and Tracer's output, just because we realize that there's a certain way to write JavaScript that is actually faster in the VM. So so I think back to his earlier question of whether or not to use TypeScript to transpile to ES6 to use Babel to transpile to ES5. I don't think it's worth the trouble to go that far. I think emitting one or the other is good enough, and even when dealing without source code, it's not that hard to kind of figure out what's going on compared to like either one of the outputs. But
yeah, I mean TypeScript definitely isn't as bad as Tracer.
No, Tracer was like really bad, but like that's like they were optimizing for like correctness. But yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great week, and we will see you next week. See you later.
See you guys.